Applying the correct standard of proof is the point where a workplace investigation moves from analysis of evidence into actual decision-making. It sets the threshold that determines how much confidence is required before a conclusion can be reached. In civil, administrative, and workplace contexts, this threshold is deliberately lower than the criminal standard of beyond a reasonable doubt, because the goal is not to assign criminal liability, but to determine what most likely happened based on available information. In most workplace investigations, the primary standard is the preponderance of the evidence, often described in simple terms as more likely than not, or 50% plus a feather. Under this approach, an investigator is essentially weighing both sides of the evidence and asking which version of events is slightly more persuasive when all facts are considered together. If the evidence tilts even marginally in one direction, that version of events is treated as established for the purposes of the investigation. Closely related to this is the concept of a good faith or reasonable conclusion. From an employer's perspective, the focus is not only on whether the outcome is correct in an absolute sense, but whether the investigation itself was fair, thorough, and grounded in evidence. In many jurisdictions, including parts of North America, employers are generally protected if they can demonstrate that they acted in good faith and reached a conclusion that a reasonable person would consider supported by substantial evidence, even if later review suggests a different outcome might also be possible. In other words, the system recognizes a key distinction. An investigation can be procedurally sound and still later be shown to have reached an incorrect conclusion without necessarily creating liability, provided the process itself was reasonable and unbiased. In civil contexts, such as claims involving discrimination, harassment, or defamation, the same preponderance standard generally applies. The burden of proof is initially on the complainant to establish that their version of events is more likely than not. In many discrimination cases, the process follows a structured shifting burden model. The employee must first establish a basic factual framework suggesting discrimination may have occurred. The employer then provides a legitimate, non-discriminatory explanation for the decision or conduct. The burden may then shift back again to the employee to show that the explanation is not genuine, but rather a pretext. In some civil matters, a higher threshold, known as clear and convincing evidence, may apply. This standard requires a higher degree of certainty than a simple balance of probabilities, but still does not reach the level required in criminal law. It is typically reserved for more serious allegations, such as fraud or certain equitable claims. In administrative settings, such as unemployment insurance boards or workers' compensation tribunals, the applicable standard is often described as substantial evidence. This does not require the most persuasive or definitive proof, but rather evidence that is sufficient for a reasonable person to reach a conclusion, even if others might reasonably disagree. These environments also tend to apply more flexible evidentiary rules, placing greater emphasis on the weight and reliability of information, rather than strict admissibility requirements. When decisions from administrative bodies are reviewed by courts, those decisions are usually given a degree of deference. As a result, a reviewing court will typically only intervene if the original decision is found to be clearly unreasonable or legally flawed. A few important principles sit underneath all of these standards. First, the standard of proof does not change based on the seriousness of the allegation or the severity of the consequence. Whether the outcome is a warning or termination, the threshold in workplace investigations generally remains the same: the balance of probabilities. Second, investigators must avoid the common mistake of applying a criminal law mindset to workplace matters. Attempting to prove a case beyond a reasonable doubt in an administrative setting often leads to unnecessary over-investigation, delays, and an unrealistic expectation of certainty that the process is not designed to achieve. Finally, investigators are expected to make a decision rather than avoid one. In cases where accounts conflict, it is not sufficient to simply label the situation as "he said," "she said," and leave it unresolved. Instead, credibility assessments such as consistency, plausibility, and motive must be used to determine which version of events is more likely than not. Failing to reach a conclusion when the evidence allows for one can itself undermine the integrity of the process. Ultimately, applying the correct standard of proof ensures that workplace investigations remain fair, consistent, and defensible. It provides the structure that allows evidence to be translated into findings that are not absolute certainties, but well-reasoned and supportable judgments about what most likely occurred.